And the next speaker today is Dr. Lionel Milgrom. So, Lionel, please.
Today's talk is going to be, I'm going to repeat some of the things I said yesterday. Repetition is always good, because then it sort of drums the message home, don't you find? But I'm also going to try and develop some of the ideas from yesterday. Now, I did say at the beginning yesterday I was going to be probably outrageous. Well, I don't know about you, but I actually felt outraged yesterday. There were a couple of things that were said. I mean, this whole business of having to sort of cart yourself over to the UK to buy homeopathic remedies, it suddenly made me realise what the whole Viking invasions were about sort of like 1,000 years ago. You're all trying to get homeopathic remedies, weren't you? So is everyone going to sort of set out from Gothenburg in longboats and they're going to sort of head up the Thames to Parliament? Can we have some remedies, please? You know, something like that. Anyway, that's what my head was doing this sometime this morning. The other thing that I found a bit strange was the claim by that was made yesterday that it's impossible to scientifically prove homeopathy. Remember when that was said? Actually, it's impossible to scientifically prove anything. Did you know that? Science doesn't prove or disprove anything. It's because what we use in science is inductive logic. You only prove things using deductive logic, like a mathematical proof. Science, in that sense, doesn't prove or disprove anything. So you can wait till hell freezes over for homeopathy to be proven. So just thought I'd throw that in for you. So where are we? Okay. Right. This talk today starts with a trial done by Brian et al., which some of you might know. It was a 5-armed, randomized controlled trial of adjunctive homeopathy in patients with active, relatively stable rheumatoid arthritis. And there's the reference to this particular trial and a comment that myself and Kate Chatfield from UCLan made on it, which is, "It's the consultation, stupid, isn't it?" Which, of course, is the title of this talk. And what this trial found was that there were sizable clinical benefits found from using homeopathy, but these were attributed solely to the innately empathic nature, of the homeopathic consultation, not to any single or complex homeopathic remedy. So, it's the consultation. And it concluded that given the magnitude of these effects and the lack of reported side effects, the impact of the homeopathic consultation is of clinical relevance to patients and clinicians alike. And here's the icing on the cake. Eds Art Ernst agrees. Put the flags out. Launch your boats. So, something for everybody. So, yes, homeopathy is partially vindicated. Yes, there's nothing in it. So we can all go away happy, or can we? Okay. Now, we all know that homeopathy violates basic principles of science. We were told that yesterday as well, as if to confirm it. And yet there's 500 million people around the world who actually benefit from it, or have used it. And we discussed yesterday whether RCTs are really all that relevant to showing whether homeopathy works or not. And the assumption that the randomized controlled trial is the best research tool to establish a therapy's evidence base, is it? And we also discussed the fact about the RCT is simplistic, its rationale is simplistic because it divides the therapy from its context in a very simplistic way. And why does it do that? Because it's an arithmetic convenience. It allows measurements, statistics, and inferences from the trial to have deterministic significance. That's why it's done. Okay. What I'm going to propose is an alternative. And that alternative is based on the notion of the quantum theoretical notion of complementarity. Now, complementarity was a term that was developed by a certain very famous Dane who lived across the water called Niels Bohr. Have you heard of him? Very famous Danish physicist. My question is, can we use complementarity to shed a different light on the meaning of this trial that Brian et al. Have done? So let's try and understand what complementarity means. So we're going to go back and look at some of those quantum theoretical concepts I mentioned yesterday. If we take photons or electrons, subatomic particles, and we fire them through a double slit. So if you imagine you've got like a gun that's firing out photons or electrons, and we imagine that those things are particles, then if they're particles and they go through this double slit, we would expect to find two spots on the screen, okay? If, on the other hand, photons and electrons behave like waves, then, as I did, by the way, did anyone do the experiment I suggested yesterday, like go down to the water and chuck a couple of rocks into the water and see what happens? No, you didn't, did you? Oh, you're such a disappointment. You really are. Well, go and do it after my talk during the coffee break. So, if these photons or electrons are waves, then they will interfere with one another, and what you'll end up with on the screen is an interference pattern. Okay? Now, this is where it gets spooky. When we actually fire the photons or electrons through the slits, and we try not to see what's going on here, we get an interference pattern, which means, yes, the photons or electrons are behaving like waves. If we now try and put an observation device in between the slit and the screen to see them behaving like waves, they behave like particles. It's almost as if they know they're being observed. Aren't they cheeky? Right. The point is this: what we observe, photons or electrons, either particles or waves, depends on the experiment that we do. And this goes back to that statement by Henry Stapp that I told you yesterday. Oh, sorry, I'm shining the laser at you. We create the universe by observing it. Okay? Now, so, depending on the experimental circumstances, light and subatomic particles are observed as wave-like or particle-like. And the point is this: we don't get both simultaneously. We can have one or the other, but not both together. That's complementarity. And the point is this: you need both to fully describe the situation. So it isn't, you can't say particles are just waves, or photons or electrons are just waves. You can't say photons or electrons are just particles. You have to use both. And you can't see both at the same time. That's the snag. But together, you get a fuller picture of reality. And that's complementarity. And this is the coat of arms that Niels Bohr designed for himself, because he was made a knight in Denmark, and the title round the top says "Contraria sunt complementa." It sounds a bit like homeopathy, doesn't it? You know, opposite to complementary. Which is interesting, because again, you see the similarity with homeopathy. I don't know if he was into homeopathy or not. It wouldn't surprise me if he was. Okay, so the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That's the point. What we observe depends on the kind of experiment we do. In other words, nature gives you the answer depending on how you ask the question. And wouldn't you know, nature doesn't speak English or Swedish or anything, as far as I know. Nature speaks experiments, essentially. No, she doesn't speak experiments. She gives answers when we ask experiments, and when we do experiments, and then they're tricksy answers. So the answer depends on the experimental question. So through the act of measurement, the observer becomes part of the observed system. We create the universe by observing it. Okay. Now, this goes very much against the idea of scientific materialism, which I mentioned yesterday, that an external reality exists whether we observe it or not, and whether we exist or not. I'm coming back to that old potato again. Prior to quantum theory, a key assumption was that everything physical is measurable or observable. But the thing is, with quantum properties, for example, like a wave function, these things can be physical, but not observable. That's just the way it is. And what they contain is what can be known about the system, not the ontological reality of that system, separate from the observer. Information or knowledge can have a more fundamental meaning than an objective reality. That's Anton Zeilinger. And essentially, what quantum theory does is it challenges materialistic objective certainty by suggesting that all there is information. Nothing else. In other words, this is where the consciousness idea comes in. And for something to be known, there has to be a knower. This statement from Max Planck, I gave you one of his statements yesterday, but this one really is a mind blower. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. That is Max Planck, the father of quantum theory, saying that in an interview with The Observer in 1931, so he's already getting very old. Okay. Now, I'd like to also... Peter, can you just pass me that bottle down there, please? Thanks. Just introduce this concept of eigenvalues. These are classical observables from experiments on quantum systems, but they're not properties of them. So when we do an experiment on a quantum system, the answer we get out is called an eigenvalue. Now, this is what a quantum physicist has said about them, which I find absolutely fantastic. These are analogous to the symptoms of a disease, which is a disturbance of the body that shows up, indicating the presence of something that does not show up. What does that remind you of? Vital force, by any chance? And that's a physicist talking. Nothing to do with homeopathy. Nothing to do with vital force. Just using that analogy. Okay. So, let's move on. Specific and non-specific effects. I talked about this yesterday. RCTs assume implicitly that they can be separated from each other and treated separately, so additively like ordinary numbers. Now, Elaine Weatherly-Jones suggested some years ago that that's not true, and I talked about that yesterday, so that specific and non-specific effects are functions of each other and non-additive. And I've written about this a few times, and Ernst's comment is that anyone who believes that is paranoid. My answer to that is just because you're paranoid doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong. So, the question is, could the RCT, as an experimental procedure, this is my point, actually produce a complementary relationship between specific and non-specific effects? That's the whole business. I gave you that spiel about complementarity and particles and waves and all that kind of thing. What I'm saying is that the RCT is a specific kind of experimental procedure. And by the mere act of making that experimental procedure, we produce that complementarity between specific and non-specific effects. It gets difficult to say when your mouth is dry all the time. You know? So that's been made specific to a certain extent. And this was mentioned yesterday, RCTs of homeopathic provings, what was called pathogenetic trials. It was interesting, actually, because I actually thought the person who was mentioning it got the word wrong. I always used to think it was pathogenic trials. Do you remember that, Alex? And we both looked it up. It's actually pathogenetic. So I stand corrected in my old age. There you go. Okay. Now, what these RCTs of homeopathic proving suggested is that there was leakage between, or non-local correlations between the verum group in a trial and the placebo group in a trial. And of course, we've talked about that as well in terms of some kind of field effect. As a result of the blinding, you get the leakage. So what blinding actually refers to is a loss of information, which then leads to leakage on non-local correlations. And the more you get blinding, the more there's likely to be this non-local correlation. Okay, no, just 1 minute. So, oops. These are the key papers here which deal with that. Dominici and Bellaviti et al. In Homeopathy, and Wallach, Mollinger and Scher in the J of Psychopharmacology. Those are the key papers there. Now, what I need to do is introduce you to a little bit of mathematical jargon. Commuting and non-commuting relationships, and this has got nothing to do with going to work in the morning, okay? What does it mean that specific and non-specific effects of a treatment are non-additive? Well, let me give you an example. Let's take ordinary numbers. Ordinary numbers commute. That is, 3 plus 4 is the same as 4 plus 3. It doesn't matter in what order I do the addition. In the same way, 3 times 4 is the same as 4 times 3. So it doesn't matter which order I do the multiplication. Do you get it? That's called commuting. Pardon?
It is not 7. 4 times 3. It's 12.
Birgitta, can I go now? That's what happens when you do things in a hurry. And I keep on telling my students where I'm working, when you're working on a calculator, make sure you check using your head first. Jesus Christ. How am I ever going to live this down? Yes, chemistry. Okay. 4 times 3 is 12, all right? We can agree on that? And 3 times 4 is 12 as well. Okay. Now, that's what I mean by commuting. It doesn't matter in which order you do things. That's what commuting means. The result's the same. But when we talk about specific and non-specific effects, if we treat them like numbers, they will commute, and then you can separate them. Not a problem. But the problem is that processes, operations, do not commute. Now, I presume quite a few people in this audience do things like cook or bake. Yeah? Who bakes bread? Right. What would happen if you did the things that you do in baking bread in a different order? Supposing you put it all into the oven first and then kneaded it. So a non-commuting number, well, non-commuting whatever, is something which has to be done in the same order. Now, when we do an RCT, then the things that you do in an RCT, like any experiment, has to be done in a certain order. Therefore, they're non-commuting. Therefore, you can't treat the results like ordinary numbers. That's the point. So, specific and non-specific effects are results from an RCT, which itself is a set of non-commuting operations. This suggests specific and non-specific effects might not be considered separately. So this is my whole argument for saying that we cannot separate specific and non-specific effects because they're non-commuting. So Ernst is wrong. If they are correlated with each other, then certainly they simply cannot be added together. They're non-additive. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So perhaps the RCT is inadequate for investigating complex therapies. And I was called paranoid for suggesting that. Okay, well, we can get over that. Now, I showed you this one yesterday. Man is the measure of all things. We talked about, does a tree crashing in a forest make a sound if there's no one there to hear? And the whole business about a remedy being homeopathic when it cures the case. The whole point about that was to show that there was some kind of correlation between the patient, the practitioner, and the remedy. So, what Brian et al. Suggest is that specific and non-specific effects of treatment are additive, that they can be separated. The whole is the sum of the parts. And so, both are amenable to simultaneous testing via the RCT. That's what they're suggesting. As it happens, their trial is seriously underpowered for remedies. But if you read through the paper, it turns out the paper is sufficiently powered for the consultation. So its conclusions, its overall conclusions are suspect. That's why they came to the conclusion that it's the consultation. Okay. But what I'm going to say now, let's just accept the results of the Bryan et al. Paper at face value. But also assuming that specific and non-specific effects are non-additive. So we're going to accept Bryan et al.'s results. What they could then be hinting at is something else. This complementarity between remedy and consultation. In other words, conventional RCTs that isolate the effect of the medicine might tend to lose sight of the consultation, whereas RCTs that attempt to isolate the effect of the consultation might lose sight of the remedy or the medicine. That's the complementarity. Now, could it be that the blinding that the RCT imposes is what actually produces that complementarity? It's quite an interesting possibility. So we can know the medicine or the consultation as parts of a complementary pair, making up a whole, but we can't know both with absolute certainty simultaneously. So it's getting like the complementarity that Niels Bohr suggested. So RCTs that emphasize the medicine might necessarily be blind to the consultation, and RCTs which emphasize the consultation, like the Bryan et al. Paper, might necessarily be blind to the medicine. So, but by their own admission, Bryan et al. is too underpowered to draw firm conclusions, whether the homeopathy's effects are due solely to the consultation or a complementary relationship with the remedy. But by implying the power of the homeopathic consultation, they might have begun to reveal how during RCTs, the therapeutic process, you can have knowledge of either the medicine or the consultation, but not both simultaneously with absolute certainty. Now, what this is a biomedical restatement of something called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You heard of that one? Yeah. Simultaneous and exact determination of the position and momentum of a subatomic particle is impossible. That's Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and this is its biochemical equivalent, as enunciated by me. Simultaneous and exact determination of specific and non-specific effects of a therapeutic procedure is impossible. I'm just floating that as a possibility. What it suggests is that ultimately the simplistic separation of specific and non-specific effects disregards an underlying complementarity between them, which is itself a consequence of how we observe a whole, integrated, irreducible, real-life phenomenon, which is the therapeutic process. When you're trying to, it's really funny watching people leave and trying to be unobserved. You know, can't go down like that. We all do it. It's great. But this itself is a consequence of how we observe this whole process. So maybe we need new approaches to investigating it. Not just in homeopathy, but as I've tried to sort of make clear through everything that I've been saying, I think this applies to the whole of conventional medicine. And I think I'll leave it there. Just like that, up in the air, finished, gone. Good night, Vienna.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Chris Jorgenfeld again.
Hello.
Hello. Remember the cat?
Yes.
Yes. Solution of the uncertainty theory.
The cat.
Ask the cat in the box.
No, my cat's at home.
I know. But I wonder, I have been studying the Finnish professor, Matti Bergström, who has been doing research on the brain his whole life. And his results says that the brain can perceive both waves and particles. But we perceive particles mostly through the right brain hemisphere, and waves, no, opposite, sorry. Left brain hemispheres are taking up the particles, while the left hemisphere is picking up the waves. And it sort of means that we have 2 dimensions, at least, within us. So he is very much into this quantum field, and the solution is really in the brain, and to accept that we do not live in a single material world. We live in several dimensions.
At once. But science doesn't actually give you that. It gives you one or the other. And then we get trapped into thinking one way or the other. Oh, yeah.
We get stuck in one brain hemisphere.
Yeah.
Instead of
Flip-flopping between both. Because we don't like flip-flopping. We always want an answer. It's got to be one thing or the other. You can't have both.
Just to say, Lionel, you're quite right. It's astonishing that this huge assumption, which underlies randomized controlled trials, has very rarely been tested. Actually, it has been tested occasionally, and there is even a systematic review of it, which comes to exactly your conclusion.
Really?
Yes.
Ah.
Published in The Lancet, done by this Dutch group, the same one who did the original meta-analysis of systematic review of homeopathy.
Okay, yeah, please do.
And what they come to the conclusion is that the assumption it's unsafe. When it's been looked at, which has been very rare actually, it nearly always looks as if there is an interaction. And you don't even necessarily need to go into quantum physics. Very often, it's just because they're working through common, the so-called placebo effects and specific effects pass through common physiological processes. So
yes.
Of course they must interact. Of course, the assumption must be that they interact.
But the reason why I take the quantum approach is because, A, it sort of gets me up here talking. That's the first thing. So it's very, very selfish. But no, seriously, there is a similarity in the approaches. When you look at the way that people have thought through quantum theory, and you look at that, as you can see, there are a lot of similarities. Sorry, I'm gassing again.
I have a more technical question.
Oh, dear.
Oh, dear. You said that the trial was underpowered to detect the effect of the remedy, but it was just powered to detect the effect of the consultation. So that means it was strong enough to detect the contribution of the consultation to the overall variability.
Apparently, yes.
But does that not mean that consultation has a stronger effect in the total than the remedy?
Well, there were obviously certain dropouts from the trial, so they couldn't actually draw the conclusions they wanted to.
Questions?
Where's she gone?
Lionel, great presentation.
Thank you.
Given that we've got 20 minutes left,
Oh, God.
and given your final statement on the screen, would this be a moment for the researchers in the room just to kind of do a bit of brainstorming on, okay, new approaches to investigating, so what are the models we should be looking at to do this? I invite Peter, all the researchers.
I'm glad you asked me that, you know.
Please.
Old, new theory of meaning. Yeah. You got a problem with that? No, it's only a couple more slides. This goes back, I mentioned Protagoras yesterday, man is the measure of all things. Of things which are that they are, things which are not that they are not. God knows what that means. This is the first phrase that always gets me, man is the measure of all things. The point is that most philosophers, from Socrates onwards, have attempted to explain meaning differently as something which is totally separate from human beings and anchored out there. I'm basically just underlining what I've been going on about in terms of objective reality. The meaning of an utterance must therefore be the reality that's referred to. The finger pointing at the moon is the moon, as opposed to the finger pointing at the moon is the finger pointing at the moon. See what I mean? Does that make sense? Absolutely. God, you'll buy anything, won't you? Okay, so let me introduce you to this guy, Professor Mark Turner. He's at the Department of Cognitive Science in Case Western University in Cleveland, Ohio. So that's redneck country in the US. And he says that this leaves the person out of the loop altogether. A semantic express train shoots straight from the linguistic symbols to an objective reality without passing through the human brain, let alone stopping there, let alone taking its entire journey there. So what he's suggesting is updating Protagoras for today, to view the person as patterns of dynamic neural activity in a human brain that's evolved to serve a human body of which it is a part. Culture, society, language, and the rest of human life are patterns in brains. Meaning is patterns in brains. So, the problem of disease, as variously understood by both conventional biomedicine and homeopathy, is ultimately just such patterns in brains. And both are meaningful for those who have those brain patterns. And that's it. Has anyone got any other better ideas? Pardon? Do you want to say something more, Stephen?
No, you haven't answered my question. So what about models that consist, or is it impossible?
What was it you were saying just now about the RCTs, Peter?
What I was saying, that there was I've just found it. There was a study published by Kleinen. Kleinen is the same guy who did the first meta-analysis of homeopathy, looking at all the studies they could find showing interactions, whether there was interaction between specific and non-specific effect. And it's published in The Lancet, and the answer is yes, there is interaction. But there's not very much, surprisingly little good evidence, but such evidence there is positive. I'll even tell you the reference if I just have it here. It's Kleinen. Oh, no, I've got to enter the password. Kleinen, published in The Lancet in 1994.
Okay. So the answer is, presumably, let's stop trying to do RCTs. Say that again? Blinded RCTs, according to Petter down here. So let's stop trying to please Ernst. Let's stop trying to be scientific. But then you have to start a revolution. And convince your governments that they should stop concentrating on science. So the answer is that I don't really have an answer short of revolution, and that doesn't do anyone any good, does it, in the end? Right, I've finished.
Right. Any questions?
What about you lot?